What happened to the ancient Egyptians? We their descendants? What happened to the ancient Romans? Are modern Italians the only survivors of this once great world power? Or has their family tree reached farther and wider than anyone has ever imagined? Where did the line of the ancient Persians go? Does it persist in the modern Middle East? Or far beyond? What about the Mayans? Does their genealogy live on, or has it disappeared altogether? The answers might surprise you.
Yes, folks, we're going to be looking at Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson's new book tonight, Traced. We've got it here in the UK, although you can only pre-order it in the UK at the moment. But if you live in the US or Canada, the book is now available, and we're glad to have Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson with us tonight. Hi, Nathaniel.
Hello, Simon, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and so tonight, folks, we're not going to be doing our usual Q&A with a speaker. We want Nathaniel to do a presentation on, I guess, an overview of his book, Traced, and there will be a time afterwards for Q&A. So if you have a burning question that you want to ask Nathaniel after his talk is done, please do remember to put that in the comments section, and we'll look to that. And so without any further ado, I'm going to disappear, and I'm going to allow Nathaniel to introduce himself, and then he can get on with his talk.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Nathaniel Jeanson, research biologist here at Answers in Genesis, offices here at the Creation Museum in Kentucky. We're also the ones with the Ark Encounter. I'll show you more about that at the very end of this talk. But I'm going to dive right into the presentation I've prepared for tonight. We're going to focus on the content of my book, which I'm calling Traced, Human DNA's Big Surprise. And I'm going to get into some of the highlights from it. And just to say a special hello to anyone who's been with us for a couple of years. If you watch the Answers in Genesis YouTube channel, or were watching what AIG was doing over the coronavirus time during lockdowns here in the United States in early spring, summer of 2020, you know we did a 25-part series called The New History of the Human Race. We promised a book from that series. This is the book we promised. It's got a different title than New History, but this is the one that we were talking about. It also represents 2 more years of research that's happened since, and there's been some spectacular discoveries we've made in the meantime, and I'm going to highlight some of those for you tonight. But before we dive into these details, I want to start by expanding our view to so much more, because there's much more at play here than just this book that I'm talking about, and it reaches to the biggest questions that organizations like Answers in Genesis deal with. I'm going to step back 4.5 years ago to the fall of 2017, when I published another book called Replacing Darwin. And the crazy thesis that this book advanced was mirrored in its title, that creationist concepts, hypotheses, models were not just rebutting Darwin, but replacing him with better ones that make better predictions. And wouldn't you know it, 4 months later, January 2018, the icon of evolution, Darwin's finches, was the subject of a new paper by Peter and Rosemary Grant, the Princeton couple who had been studying them for decades. They announced that the formation of a new species in real time. If you look at the details of the paper, the rate at which this new species had formed, plus the genetic mechanisms by which it had formed, both matched exactly what had been predicted in Replacing Darwin several months prior. In fact, I didn't find out about this until February 2018, which is, of course, the month when lots of the evolutionists, atheists celebrate Darwin's birthday, Darwin's month. And so they were gleefully reveling in this new finding, saying we can rub this in the creationists' faces. And that's how I became aware of this, and was surprised myself to see just how closely these results were mirrored. So you can go to our website, answersingenesis.org, just type in bombshell in the search engine. You'll find this article as well as the second one that deal with how these predictions were fulfilled. And I bring this up because we're now 4.5 years into this bold claim, and we've now reached another major milestone on the question of human origins and human history. Creationist ideas are performing even better than expected. Creationists are now making major scientific discoveries, ones that are adding not just new chapters to the understanding of our past, to our origins and our history, but entirely new volumes. And that's going to be the focus for tonight. I want to tell you about 9 new volumes that this creationist research is adding to the understanding of our past. And I'm going to focus heavily on one, because that's the primary focus and angle of the book dealing with human history. And then I'm going to briefly go with the other 8 very fast at the end. But the first 40 minutes or so, we're going to focus just on one. And I'm going to illustrate this volume of new discovery by drawing our attention to one major ancient civilization, which will be the illustration for this larger question. When I last took history, human history, world history, in high school, there was a question that nagged at me and has nagged at me for years, until the last few when I started to work on this particular scientific research. That was the question of the who of human history, or really the rest of the story. So thinking about ancient Egypt, if you're like me, you probably learned here's when the civilization was founded, here's when the civilization was overthrown, and that's as much as discussed usually in history class. So if I were to ask you, when did the ancient Egyptian civilization begin? You might say, well, that's easy. It's a cradle of civilization, one of the very beginning points. And there were multiple cradles of civilization. You might think of ancient Sumer in the Middle East, the Minoans here in Crete as the European cradle of civilization, the Egyptians here astride the Nile, the Indus River Valley near India and modern Pakistan, the Yellow River civilization in China, and then, of course, the Olmecs in Mexico. But this really just pushes our question one step backwards. What were the Egyptians doing before they founded the cradle of civilization? What people did they come from? What's their origin? And just calling it a cradle doesn't answer that question. If you then fast forward to the other side of Egypt's political history, you've got another question to answer. When their last dynasty fell, what happened to the people? Are their descendants with us? And that's, of course, what that commercial beginning of this alluded to. Now, these questions aren't as simple as they might first appear. And I'm going to focus especially on this latter question and draw out its implications and the dilemma that we face. And to draw this out more clearly, I want to first highlight for you that the ancient Egyptian civilizations, the stuff that gets all our attention, was primarily an African civilization. Of course, you might say it's geographically African, up here astride the Nile, but it's geographically close to Asia and interacted with ancient Asian kingdoms, Middle Eastern kingdoms, technically African. And I'm going to point out it's not just geographically African, but the pharaohs who ruled were African. Some were Libyans, some were Cushites, many were Egyptians. On occasion, you had invasions from Asia that disrupted the pharaonic rule, but each time then, except for the last time, African dynasties reemerged. You think about the Valley of the Kings, where King Tut's tomb was found. These are African pharaohs. You think about the Great Pyramids of Khufu and his son Khafra. These are African pharaohs. You think about the hieroglyphic language, the pantheon of Egyptian deities. These are African concepts. This is African religion, African language. Through and through, when we think about ancient Egypt, we're talking about an African civilization. And I've pounded the pulpit, so to speak, on this point, because all that underwent a dramatic change beginning in about the 600s BC. Mid-600s BC, the Assyrian conquerors and Asian peoples came down into Egypt and began the permanent end of the African pharaonic rule. You can see here, this map shows the successive expansion of the Assyrian kingdom with time. The key point for us here is this dark blue, which corresponds to right here, 650 BC, come in and conquer down the Nile. Now, over the next century, the Africans would throw off this rule, but then eventually the Persians came along, invaded Egypt as well. You can see the ancient Persian Empire marches down here into ancient Egypt. That's 525 BC. And just like with the Assyrians, the Egyptians rebelled against Persian rule for the next 2 centuries. But then Alexander comes in with his Greek armies, invades Egypt as well, and this brings the rule of the African pharaohs to a permanent end. The Greeks themselves were eventually conquered by the Romans. The Romans, of course, ruled Egypt as well. Here's the Roman Empire at one of its greatest extents in 117. You can see again it reaches down here into modern Egypt. The Roman Empire eventually split up. The eastern half, the Byzantine Empire, continued on. But the next major power to arise and also conquer Egypt was not a European one, but an Asian one. In the 600s AD, Muhammad and his Arab Muslim armies marched out of the Arabian Peninsula, out of Asia, and then you can see her across into North Africa, including Egypt, the other direction as well, into the Central Asia up here, and even touched and ruled Europe, Spain, for several centuries. Fast forward through more of Egyptian history, just to get us to the end here. One of the last kingdoms to rule Egypt was the Turkish Ottoman Empire. The Turks originally hailed from Central Asia. They moved down here into modern Anatolia in the 1000s AD, but you can see they also extended their rule. And in fact, Turkish people themselves, the Maliks, ruled Egypt for a time. The ancient Egyptians were Africans, ruled by Africans. The past 2,500 years, it's been Europeans and Asians who've been in control. And now if you go to ancient Egypt, you won't find the rulers of the country building pyramids themselves like the ancient Egyptians did. If you listen to the major language in Egypt, you'll hear something that's not African, but Asian in origin, Arabic, thanks again to the Muslim invasions of the 600s. The major religion also comes from Asia, from the Arabian Peninsula, Islam. In Egypt, there are others, but this is the dominant one. And from this perspective, modern Egypt has a very Asian flavor to it, not an African one. So it's worth re-asking the question, do any descendants of the ancient Egyptians exist to this day? Who do the modern Egyptians come from? And this, again, is just one illustration of the larger of the history of the peoples of our globe. Now, the answer to this question, or the answer that I'm going to propose, and which I propose in the book Traced, Human DNA's Big Surprise, is what we're calling the new Rosetta Stone of human history. The old Rosetta Stone was an actual stone that had several different languages inscribed on it. At that time, 1799, when this stone was discovered, the hieroglyphic language was still a great mystery, and this window into ancient Egypt's past was closed. And the fact that they had now an ancient Egyptian script alongside a readable Greek script allowed this code to be cracked. This new Rosetta Stone that we're calling is a DNA-based generation by generation family tree for global humanity, and the implications are not just a new window into Egypt's past, but the window to the past of every people group on Earth. Now, just to clarify exactly how this data, this sort of tree, is derived, this is based on the male inherited DNA. For technical reasons that I'll just take of time, I discuss a little bit in the book, but just to allude to them briefly, the DNA you inherit from both parents, which is about 99% of our DNA, allows you to go back reliably only a few generations. It doesn't take you into the distant past. The female inherited DNA, the mitochondrial DNA, also, you might have heard me discuss this in previous lectures, previous books. It does take us back to the flood of Noah and to Eve. It's a DNA-based clock, but there's a lot of statistical noise in it, so much so that if you try to be precise and pick out specific historical events, it's very difficult to do so with any reliability. Because of the statistical noise, the Y chromosome, male inherited DNA, doesn't have this. So there's the technical aside for why I've stuck with this particular genetic tool in the book and in this talk. The way this section of DNA marks off and allows us to create a family tree comes from two factors. So first of all, it's inherited. So if you're a male, you get your Y chromosome tested, you can identify your father, your parental lineage. So this DNA, it's the substance of heredity. It marks who you come from. There's also something else that goes on as it's passed on fathers to sons. As the sperm cells are given this Y chromosome, this Y chromosome has to undergo a copying process from dad into the sperm cells. That process is imperfect, and about 3 DNA letters change per generation. So if you were to compare my dad's Y chromosome to my Y chromosome, there'd be about 3 differences due to these 3 mistakes. And if you were to compare my chromosome to my son's Y chromosome, there'd be 3 more mistakes. So if you compare my sons to my dad's, 2 generations worth, there would be 6 differences. These add up over time. And so DNA also acts like a clock. It marks time. So ancestry and time, this is what you need to create a family tree. You can compare the Y chromosome sequences from any 2 men around the globe, count the number of differences, and that tells you how recently or how long ago in the distant past these 2 men shared a common paternal ancestor. This tree that I'm showing you here on the screen, and many of the slides that you'll see here, the images you will find in the book itself, taken directly from it. There's about half the book, half the, well, I'll show you a picture of it here at the end. I'll hold it up for you, but you can see the middle section is all images. There's about 235 color plates. They tell the story, and you'll get a flavor for this as we go along. This tree is based on the DNA from living men, about 600 of them, and they are drawn from, and these men hail from, basically every habitable continent. You've got Native Americans in this tree, you've got Europeans, North Africans, Sub-Saharan Africans, Middle Easterners, South Asians, like from India or Pakistan, East Asians, Southeast Asians, people from the Pacific. So from Guinea, you have some of those men in here. Very good representative sample. I'm going to show you data from more than this tree, but this is a great visual to see the basic structure, the lay of the land. There aren't any Egyptians in this specific sample, but there are plenty of Egyptians who've had their DNA tested, and you can say, okay, they belong to this particular branch, and this gives us a reference point by which to understand their history. You'll also notice there's some color in this tree. There's color coding to the branches, and that's to highlight these, what may seem like inscrutable, confusing designations. There's a method to this madness. It's not a pretty method, but it's a functional method. The scientific community has chosen to assign somewhat arbitrarily letters of the alphabet to the deepest branches. So you can see over here in red, C has a fairly deep branch. And just to clarify here, time moves from top to bottom. The beginning of human history is up here. The present would be down here by the tips of these branches, or the tips down here. So C in red, branch C is this very deep branch over here. A and B have a very deep connection. It happens to be back here. Group D, which is kind of this dark greenish blue color, branches off right. And it separates from group E. Now you can see sort of a stair-step pattern in group E. Again, this is probably zoomed way out. It might be small on your screen, but I'll try to point it out for you. And then, of course, in the book, we zoom in on many of these specific aspects chapter by chapter. When these deep subdivide, which in this branch labeled E happens many times, the next in the labeling process is to assign a number. So this very light pink branch, you may not even be able to see it, E2. The other side of that would be E1. E1 further subdivides and subdivides and subdivides and subdivides, so much so that when you get down here, you have E1b in tan and E1b1a in darkish brown. Now, there's color coding here because I wanted some sort of system to keep the labeling consistent throughout the book when I'm talking about a map or a branch, or anytime I'm referring to a specific section of the tree, I keep the color coding consistent so you can follow it more easily. The same thing will be true go on in this talk. So where should we start if we're looking for the lineage of the ancient Egyptians? What I also mentioned here at this stage is this book and my research does not take into account DNA from fossils or from mummies or from the deceased. The mainstream community does. I've published independent evidence indicating that the DNA sequences that are published from, let's say, a mummy are not reliable. I wish they were, because it'd be a fantastic piece of data by which to compare these conclusions. I've been suspicious of this, what's called ancient DNA, for quite some time, because my own experience has been, and everyone in the field knows, DNA degrades with time. It's not a very stable molecule. So when someone dies, their body degrades, their DNA degrades. And if the DNA sequence degrades, how can you extract information from it? They still try. They say, well, we've been able to eliminate a lot of the degraded, it's still valid. But it's fair to raise the question, how do we know it's valid? And I have independent evidence to test that. And I think we can say, unfortunately, it's not reliable. And so therefore, I don't use it. The flip side of this is when I leave ancient DNA out, we make tremendous sense of the history that we do see among the branches derived from the DNA of living men. So we're going to start with modern Egyptians, which basically starting in the present And then we're going to try to work our way backwards in time to figure out who the modern Egyptians come from. And our hope is, we will eventually bump into the ancient Egyptian people. And again, this is simply an illustration, an extended illustration for the type of thing you can do for every ancient civilization that once walked on Earth, assuming they didn't completely extinct, but that sort of thing you probably could eventually uncover with this tree as well. The branch to which the plurality of Egyptian males belongs today, and I say plurality because there's no branch that is actually a majority. The plurality of Egyptian men belong to E1B1B. What that means is 60% of Egyptian men belong to something else. Now, I said the highest level among Egyptian men is E1B1B, which means everything else is less than 40%. And the only way you make that math work is by dividing Egyptian men across many branches. And that's the reality. So right now, without having told you anything about the history in E1B1B, I can tell you, and you can infer then from this math, that modern Egyptian men belong to a diversity of branches. And of course, why should it be any different? They've been ruled by foreign powers for 2,000, 2,500 years. They've had a fairly tumultuous history. So why shouldn't they have genetic inputs from several parts of the planet? This is the highest levels. So we're going to come back to the details branch in a moment. The first thing I want to do, though, is give you a sense for the global distribution of this lineage. It's not just ancient Egyptians that belong to E1B1B. Some of you watching might belong to E1B1B. You'll notice here, so I should clarify before I tell you all the various places it's found. Again, I've got these colored circles, same color as the branch, of various sizes. The size of the circle represents the relative abundance. So among modern Somali men, I think around 77% belong to E1B1B. I mentioned Egyptians, about 40%, their circle is smaller than the Somali one. North Africa, fairly large circles. You see this spill over into Europe. The circles are smaller, but they're there. You don't see some in India or in China, in the Americas. Now, the Americas I've deliberately left out because if there is E1B1B in the Americas, we know how it got there. It was due to the recent era of European colonialism, or in some cases to the ugly history of the transatlantic slave trade. My interest for purposes of this talk and for the book are the indigenous histories. So when there's a distribution that we can easily chalk up to recent colonialism, I just leave it out for sake of ease and allow us to look deeper in history. So in the old world, India and Russia and Kazakhstan and China and Mongolia and such, where there's no circle, what that means is that E1B1B exists at levels of less than 1% or is entirely detectable. So this is where we find it by and large in our world today, concentrated in northern and eastern Africa, spills over into the Middle East, and also even into Europe. One of the first things that strikes me about this distribution, about this map, is the way it seems to overlap, in part, the distribution of a political kingdom, that of Arab Muslim empire to which I referred just a few slides ago, one of the rulers of Egypt closer in the modern era, the AD era. So what I want you to notice is where the Arab Muslims conquered and where they didn't. They conquered North Africa, parts of Europe, Middle East, of course, Central Asia, but not into India. And when you look at E1B1B, you find it in the Middle East and North Europe, gets up into Central Asia, but not India. Sure, it spills over into places where the Arab Muslims have a political kingdom, like down here in East Africa and moving towards Southern Africa. They ruled Spain, but not all of Europe. And the book goes through some of the reasons why I think this is still consistent with the Arab Muslim rule. They were overthrown by others. So you have to really interpret this not just through the lens of what did the Arab Muslims do, but what did the kingdoms after them do. Regardless, at this stage, there's enough of a correlation that I think it would be fair to dig deeper and see if there's any additional evidence that E1B1B might have something to do with this distant, in terms of about 1,400 years ago, this distant Arab Muslim conquest. And so where we're going to turn next is to the details of branch E1B1B. I'm going to zoom in and rotate this so you can see the individual men on it in this particular sample, and more importantly, the timing and the details of when these branching events occur. Now, I've colored the beginning of this branch tan and these sub-branch colors so that you can see there's a significant event on right here. You can see that this one branch becomes 1, 2, 3 branch, and the date I've assigned it here is the 300s to 600s AD. That's the first thing I want to draw your attention to. We'll come back to this in a moment. Why is that significant? Well, there's something very profound about that observation, going from 1 branch to 3 branches, which when I explain it to you, you'll probably say, aha, of course. It's a simple point, but it's not always immediately obvious. So let me explain it by making an analogy or using another illustration that's probably familiar to readers of Scripture, to Christians and such. An Old Testament example, the origin of the 12 tribes of Israel, from Jacob. So Jacob, brother of Esau, has 12 boys. This is his male family tree, which of course we're talking about the Y chromosome, male inherited DNA, so this is especially relevant. You would see this way, 1 branch up and then 12 branches going down to his sons. If you take away the names, this is what the structure is like. My point here, again, is very simple. The number of branches goes from 1 to 12. The number of branches in a family tree reflects population size and changes in population size. It is true for nuclear families. Jacob, 12 branches leading to sons. It's true for the entire globe. So when you have a sample of men from particular sections of the globe, the brancher will tell us something about changes in population size in their history. Now, let's go back and revisit this. This says, so it's moving here from left to right now instead of top to bottom. So at some point in the history of these men, so this branch up here has a whole bunch of Moabites. These were the North Africans who were part of this particular study of 600 men. They're from Algeria. There's some Bedouins who are from the Middle East. There's in this particular, in this section of the tree, E1B, 1B, there's Bantu, men, sub-Saharan Africans from South Africa, Kenya. There's some Europeans, Sardinians, Mandenkas here, which are African, Basque from Europe, Druze from the Middle East. Places we just looked at on the map, North Africa, Europe, Middle East, and such. And they have a common ancestor, these men, back in the 300s to 600s. Before that time, there was a single branch. Again, this is a history specifically for these men in this study, but it's representative of their regions. There was 1 branch and then it multiplied to 3. So apply that lesson from the history of Israel, from Jacob's family tree. The number of branches reflects changes in size. So at some point in these guys' history, around the 300s to 600s, we went from having whatever represents 1 branch to something represented by 3 branches. What this means is there was a 3-fold increase in population size in the history leading up to these men. Okay, so what? That's actually a clue. And I'll explain why with these graphs, and I'll explain them here in detail in a moment. We're going to walk through these slowly so we're all on the same page. The first thing I want to point out, though, is that these graphs are derived on data that is not genetic in nature. Before any Y chromosome data were published, this is the type of history that's been inferred from archaeological data, from historical records. So if, for example, the Roman Empire would take, the ancient Roman Empire would take censuses of its citizens. So there you have a historical anchor point by which to then try to take good guesses as to how many people were alive at various points in various parts of the globe. The Chinese Empire did the same thing. You can look at archaeological remains. Here's how big the city was, and then it made how many people would be needed to sustain the city, and so on. That's what these graphs represent. They are broken into 4 different quadrants. Each represents a different geographic region. The Arabian Peninsula, a conglomerate of countries here, Iran and Turkey, and just so we're all thinking about it the same way, let me highlight what these regions are on a map for you. So when I say the Arabian Peninsula, I'm talking about the modern countries of Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, the UAE, Qatar, and such. The middle conglomerate of countries is really the heart of the Middle East, sort of this ancient bridge across the great rivers, Euphrates and Tigris and such. Modern countries of Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, and so forth. And then, of course, Turkey and Iran round out this. We're talking about the essence of the Middle East, and I've broken it into these four regions for reasons that will become clear momentarily. Each of these graphs on the horizontal axis represents about 2,200 years of history. Way over here on the left, this negative number represents the BC era. I've got year 0 here, even though it doesn't exist, just because it makes it easier to graph in Excel. Then you've got it going all the way to 200, 400 AD, 600, 1000 AD, 2000 AD. And this is, again, the same for each of these horizontal axes for these in these various regions. On the vertical axis is the absolute population size. Now, the numbers at the top are different because these regions harbor different numbers of people over time. The Arabian Peninsula stops at 16 million. This conglomerate, 30 million. Iran, 40 million. Turkey, 40 million. And so what we're seeing here is a change in population size over time. I've got two lines. There's a solid black line and a dashed gray line. The dashed gray line is the actual rises and falls of populations throughout history. Now, why would I not just stick with that? The reason, again, is somewhat technical in nature, but it has to do with the fact that we're taking DNA and reconstructing family trees from the survivors of history, from living men. So you can see here in the Arabian Peninsula, from about 500 AD onwards, the population kept growing to about 600, but then it declined again and came back down in about 1100. So these guys, not everyone up here left descendants to this day. So if we're reconstructing family trees from DNA, from the survivors, we need to compare them to appropriate historical data. And that's why I've drawn this black line. It's sort of the minimum population growth curve. Another thing I want to draw to your attention is something in common among all four graphs. You can see all of them have portions flat, and then there's this big spike here at the end. And this is generally true here around the globe, not just the Middle East. Beginning about the 1400s, the whole world began to experience growth, and a dramatic growth in population size. The world population in 1400 was about 350 million. Now it's close to 8 billion. It's a over 20-fold increase, massive increase. That tends to swamp the nuances of population rises and falls that precede it. In other words, you may not notice it visually here. So what I'm going to do in the next slide is zoom in so that we're not so visually distracted by this late spike. And this is where things get really interesting and where the Arabian Peninsula is particularly unique compared to the rest of the Middle East. And this will give us a clue then about E1B1B and perhaps its connection to ancient Egypt. So in the conglomerate region of the Middle East, this black line is basically flat, 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 flat for 2,000 years almost, about. Not quite, maybe a millennium and a half, a little bit of uptick here, flat. And then finally around 1800 starts spiking upward. Iran, flat, 200 BC all the way up to 1400. Then it finally starts rising, flat, then rises again. Turkey, from 200 BC onward, flat, slight rise in 1100, flat again. Then 1400 finally starts permanently rising. The Arabian Peninsula is the exception. It is flat from about 500-ish AD till about 1100, slight rise, and flat again till about 1750 maybe, then it's a permanent rise. Prior to 500, you see this gradual increase, not flat. There's growth. And if you were to compare it and try to read off the numbers here, about 200 BC, the population size is 1.5 million. And then about 500 BC, it's close to perhaps a little bit over 4 million. Well, 1.5 times 2 is 3. 1.5 times 3 is 4.5. So from about 200 BC to about 500 AD, the population size in the Arabian Peninsula almost tripled. And that's right in line with what this family tree seems to indicate. 1 branch to 3 branches. That's a tripling right in the time frame when we'd expect an Arabian population to look like this. They're the one section of the Middle East that has this growth. The other places are flat, flat, flat. So here's a second line of evidence that seems consistent with E1B1B, having been in the Arabian Peninsula around the time that the Arab Muslim armies began on their conquests. There's a third line of evidence I'm going to go through just very briefly for sake of time so we don't run too long, but it comes from linguistics, languages. Arabic is one of the main languages, like I mentioned, in Egypt as well in the Middle East. It belongs to a larger classification of languages known as the Afro-Asiatic language family. And if you're a Christian creationist, when you think about the Tower of Babel, a good first approximation of the units that left Babel are the language families, just as a good general rule of thumb, first approximation. And if you look at the distribution of Afro-Asiatic language families, to which Arabic belongs, again, it kind of mirrors where the Arab Muslim armies went, and it has a very strong geographic overlap where E1B1B is most abundant. So altogether, these lines of evidence from looking at where E1B1B exists today, where the political conquest of the Arab Muslim armies went, where Arabic languages, Afro-Asiatic languages are spoken today, as well as the specific branching structure, the details about population growth in E1B1B. All this seems consistent with E1B1B having come from the Arab armies and having been here in the 600s AD. That is not Africa. That's Asia. And so if we were to stop here, we might want to give up and say, forget it, let's move on. This looks like an Asian lineage that came into Egypt late in history, consistent with what we know about Egypt's history. They've been ruled by Asians and Europeans for quite some time. But I haven't taken you back deeper in the history of E1B1B. I took you back to about the 600s AD. There's thousands of years prior to that. If you think in terms of a young Earth time scale, the flood we'd put around 2500 BC. So what's the deeper history of E1B1B? I've zoomed out here a little bit. The exact details of this you don't have to see right now. I'm going to zoom in on this branch here in a moment. But E1B1B, this tan section of the tree, joins another section known as E1B1A, dark brown, and the date for that is about the 700s to 400s. That'll become relevant in a moment. But for the time being, consider what this simple fact implies. E1B1B looks like it was in the Arabian Peninsula in the 600s AD. But it's joined to another branch. And the way they're joined, the fact that they are joined means that they once had a common ancestor, which means wherever E1B1A exists today, it must have once been in the same place as E1B1B. They once shared a common ancestor. So we're going to briefly explore the history embedded in the E1B1A lineage, and then come back to E1B1B to see what it implies about the deeper history. Today, E1B1A is a dominantly sub-Saharan African lineage. I'm going to bring in language just real fast because there's a correlation here as well. I talked about the North African language family, Afro-Asiatic, that also spills over into the Middle East, not shown here, but in the previous map it did. There's also other language families in Africa, and the one that's most relevant to E1B1A is this tan one, Niger-Congo. It overlaps very tightly. Again, there's E1B1A that goes beyond it, but there's a pretty good correlation between where Niger-Congo languages are spoken in this tan color and where these big brown circles are. Now, again, the size of the circle represents the relative abundance of E1B1A. In Nigeria, for example, Nigerian men, more than 90% of them belong to E1B1A. If you're African American and you're watching this, again, the history of African Americans due to the ugly practice of the transatlantic slave trade puts the ancestry of African Americans primarily West Africa or the western coast of Africa, which is where the slaves were kidnapped from primarily. About 60% of African Americans belong to E1B1A. On this language map, I had here labeled Bantu. Bantu is a subcategory of Niger-Congo languages that will be relevant for reasons I'll explain momentarily. This subgroup of languages is thought to have expanded from the area around Nigeria and Cameroon down into Central and Southern Africa in the recent past. Or at least it used to be thought of that way. Let me give you a quote from a mainstream history textbook from a guy, so this guy's not a creationist for all I know, where he talks about how people used to think about the origin of Bantu languages, how they think now, and then we're going back to E1B1A because there's a pretty big surprise, I think, embedded in that genetic structure. So this historian, Kevin Chillington, says, before the development of radiocarbon dating and widespread archaeological research that's taken place since the 1950s, it was believed, so he's saying this is how it used to be. So back then it used to be thought that Bantu speakers spread across Eastern, Central, and Southern Africa in the comparatively recent past. That's the way people used to think, is what he says. The main source of evidence was oral traditions, which seldom traced ruling lineages back more than 500 years. So he says, if you ask the people themselves, the speakers in Africa of Bantu languages, who do you come from? Where do you come from? They'd say, well, you can go back and this far, and you kind of stop after 500 years. So he says it was assumed, therefore, that to have populated the subcontinent in so short a time, the last 500 years, there must have been large-scale conquering migrations of whole new peoples. Now, he goes on to say, well, we don't think that anymore. Now we have archaeological methods, radiocarbon dating, and we now know it took thousands of years. Now, here's a question worth considering. Does archaeology record the history of peoples or of dinner plates? And I say that rather bluntly. Of course, it records more than dinner plates, but that's pottery is heavily what archaeology discovers. It's not a direct record of peoples. I can change my dinnerware today and it has nothing to do with who I came from, where I come from. I've made a decision. It can tell you a lot. I'm not trying to knock the field of archaeology. My point is, let's recognize its strengths and its limitations. And also remember the fact that the people themselves seem to indicate that a recent origin. If you look at the branching structure in E1B1A, something really intriguing emerges. I've colored in pink a specific subset of men in this study. There they are, Mandenka people. They come from Guinea, so far Western Africa. Many of the other men in the study come from, let's say, Central and Southern Africa. We've got Bantu from Kenya and such. I want you to notice when the far western branches, in pink, break away from the other branches. So there's Yorubas from Nigeria, Bantu from Kenya. There's Biaka Pygmies, I think, from Central Africa. Yorubas, Biakas, and so forth. Mabuti Pygmies. 1400s to 1600s, 1200s to 1400s. There's also technical reasons why behind what I'm about to say, but the timing of all this seems oddly correlated with what the Bantu peoples themselves say about the timing of their migration, or imply about the timing of their migration. What I'm suggesting is that E1B1A, given its geographic distribution, so that's the map of languages. If I go back to the slide that has the languages in E1B1A overlapped, you can see there's a pretty strong overlap. But given the timing of when these branches broke apart and went their separate ways, this does seem like it's a fairly good echo, perhaps the genetic record of that event. I'm suggesting that the Bantu languages did in fact happen in the recent past, as the oral histories indicate. Now, let me stop here and make a clarification. These dates that I've been giving you are all based on viewing the entire Y chromosome-based family tree as recording only 4,500 years of history. I'm saying the beginning, 4,500 years ago, down to the present. And then within that framework, you start assigning dates. If you say, no, we're going to say this time scale, or excuse me, we say this whole tree represents a time scale of hundreds of thousands of years, as the mainstream scientific community does, these dates dramatically change. You do not get AD 1400s, AD 1500s as the dates for these separations. In mainstream science, they would say these separations happened 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. So all those correlations to the oral history of the peoples themselves evaporate. One of the points of the book is that when you use the young Earth timescale, the known events of history, whether it's indigenous or well-known like the Roman Empire, those genetic echoes emerge. And then again, if you use the old time scale, you don't see that. The mainstream, the young Earth time scale works. It makes good sense of what we see. So the question I wanted to answer with this E1B1A, just to remember where we had begun, the question I wanted to answer is, where did this come from? We know that E1B1A once had a common ancestor with E1B1B. So everything I've told you so far about E1B1A suggests that this correlated with the Bantu expansion. So the homeland of E1B1A was probably the homeland of the Bantu speakers before they spread out, which will put it up here, perhaps Nigeria, Cameroon, or even over here into West Africa. Okay, it's a step I'm taking so that we can take some more steps, logical steps, to figure out the deeper history of E1B1B. So I've got a homeland for E1B1A, perhaps in the 1500s AD, West Africa, Nigeria, Cameroon. E1B1B in the 600s AD seems to be in Arabia, not Africa. Yet, on this family tree, they were once joined. They must have been in the same location. So let's talk about this, think about this with this visual in front of us. Homeland for E1B1A around the 1500s AD. Homelands for E1B1B around the 600s AD. Yet they were once in the same location. Shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. This line runs through Chad, Sudan, Eritrea. And again, to think about the time frame that we're looking at, 700s to 400s BC is when they must have been the same spot. And then several, or about 1,000 years later, you've got some of their descendants out here. And then much later, you've got some of the descendants out here. What's intriguing to me is that in this region of the globe, in Africa, in the centuries between 700s BC and 600s AD, there was a kingdom known as the Kingdom of Axum that connected East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. So this began around the time of Christ and lasted several centuries. And then, of course, Muhammad and his followers go conquering. Most of this line from Nigeria, so this from the area covered by this dark brown over to the tan, most of this line runs through Africa, number one. And then there's this kingdom right here that connects East Africa and Yemen, Asia, point number two. Together, these lines of evidence would seem to suggest that the ancestors to this branch and to this branch were once somewhere out here in Africa. And I think there's another line of evidence consistent with this. If you look at the geography of Africa, and just for sake of time, I'm going to make this point quickly. Africa is surrounded by water on several sides. This presents a formidable barrier for any potential invader army. You'd have to float your armies across the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, if you want to start conquering sub-Saharan Africa. Europe is very close to North Africa, and the Romans and others conquered parts of North Africa, but that's where they stopped, because even though there's no water to cross, there's this gigantic desert that any general would be a fool to march his armies across and then conquer down here. So Africa's been very insulated for thousands of years. If you want to get in, your options are, and in fact, perhaps the best way to get into Africa is either down here, where I mentioned there was a connection, Kingdom of Axum, between modern Eritrea and modern Yemen, or up here via the Sinai Peninsula and then down the Nile. Nile takes you all the way from the Mediterranean to the heart of sub-Saharan Africa. There's a branch also that comes out here to Ethiopia. I forget if it's the Blue Nile or the White Nile, but if you're an invader from outside Africa, one of your best chances is to come in this way and then follow the Nile. Another reason why, if you think about the population of Africa or the settling of Africa, and if you have a cradle of civilization up here, this is your way in. Now I want to draw our attention back to the dates, 700s BC to 400 BC. And our big question, of course, could this be connected to ancient Egypt? There are African dynasties ruling Egypt at this time. In fact, one is the dark-skinned Nubian dynasty, 25th dynasty of Egypt, ruled from about the late 700s, so about 720 BC to the mid-600s, about 650s BC. They were the dynasty that were ruling when the Assyrians marched in and kicked them out. So that age range falls right within, or excuse me, the dates dynasty falls right within this age range for when these two lineages split. Could this have been the line of the ancient Nubians, one of the rulers of ancient Egypt, and after the Assyrians kicked them out, two of these groups went separate ways? So that's an image of what these people would have looked like, and it's the Assyrians who come down this way, kick them out. This is a very intriguing correlation to me. So what I'm suggesting is that these lines of evidence together seem consistent with the ancestors to E1B1B and E1B1A have been somewhere up here. Perhaps the ancient Egyptians themselves, perhaps the ancient Nubians, perhaps it's distinguishable because these two kingdoms interacted with each other throughout much of their history. So at some point in the ancient past, the ancestor was up here, the E1B1 ancestor, and then something happened, the 700s to 400s BC, that sent them packing either this way or that way. And I think the kingdom brings those guys over here into Arabia. The conquest of Muhammad and the Arabs brings it up here back into North Africa. And then, of course, later in history, E1B1A ends up out here, and very recently ends up migrating down here through sub-Saharan Africa through the Bantu expansion. That narrative seems to make sense of the evidence that we have. I haven't yet fully answered the question whether or not this was the ancient Egyptians, but it gets us pretty close. Even though E1B1B, the most abundant lineage among modern Egypt in the recent past came out of Arabia, in the ancient past it was African. And so at a minimum, what you can say is modern Egyptians look like they are indeed the descendants of ancient Africans, ancient Northeast Africans. And this sort of analysis is the type of thing you can do with this new Rosetta Stone, this Y chromosome-based tree, for basically every other ancient civilization. And through chapter by chapter, representative ancient civilizations from the regions of the globe, and you get a tour of world history, a revolutionary tour of world history, giving you the history of the peoples in each of those locations. So this is a massive volume that this new creationist discovery begins to write for the world. Now, I said I had 8 more, and we're going to do them really fast, just to give you a sense of what's going on. Another historical question that has long bothered me is something I'm going to put under the heading of so-called prehistory. So if you're a creationist, this would be the time period post-Babel, but before written records, or a time period post-Babel when the records of their history got destroyed or lost. One of the main segments of so-called prehistory is the pre-Columbian Americas, the history of the Americas before Europeans arrived. I grew up learning next to nothing about them. To give you a little bit of a spoiler, this era, when examined in light of this new DNA-based tree, gets a dramatic, radical rewrite. There are new events in pre-Columbian history that this tree reveals. There have been several settlings of the Americas that no one's talked about up until this point. And of course, prehistory is often applied to pre-colonial Africa, pre-colonial Pacific. The Y chromosome tree informs this as well. Third volume of history that this tree addresses and begins to write deals with biblical events. If you look at Genesis 10, there's a very specific genealogy that's recorded through Shem, Japheth, and Ham. You may not be able to read these names. You can see them in the book. You can zoom in there and get the details. That I'm just making a bigger picture point here for the moment. Shem's genealogy goes down 6 generations from Noah. Japheth's down only 3. Ham's down to mainly 3 and then over to 4. I'm going to rotate it like this because you see this exquisite level of genealogical detail recorded at the base of the Y chromosome tree. You can see 3 major divisions. You can see a longer genealogy down through Shem, a shorter one through Ham. And there's so much more biblical data that's relevant here. It works out in a way I never would have imagined. This is something we didn't discuss years ago in the video series because we hadn't yet discovered it. This is something that finally appeared about April of 2021. What this means is every single people group can, in theory, trace their ancestry back to specific sons of Noah, and in some cases, even specific Edition listed in Genesis 10. Now let's go back to the question of ancient Egypt. E1B1B, is this the lineage of ancient Egypt? And the reason we can even ask is because the Bible tells us who the ancient Egyptians came from. If you look at the details of Genesis 10, I'll zoom in here, Ham's genealogy. One of his sons is Misraim. That's the Hebrew term. Cush as well. Most of our English Bibles translate Misraim they don't transliterate it as something else. Cush is often translated as Sudan or Ethiopia. Misraim as translated as Egypt, which of course receives a great deal of attention in the Bible. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years. So is E1B1B in the line of Misraim? If you look at the Hamitic side of the tree, there are 4 branches, which candidates for the 4 major sons of Ham. Now, if you were to ask me which I lean towards, I actually think E1B1B is probably part of Cush's lineage. If for no other reason, Egypt has been ruled by foreign powers such a long time, those seem to have suppressed it. And I've got another candidate for ancient Egypt. That's just where I lean at the moment. There's more research that needs to be done. And really, if you think about it, Cush and Misraim were forth so long during their history, it's almost hard to distinguish the two, because Egypt sometimes conquered Nubia, Nubia sometimes ruled Egypt, and back and forth. Third volume, we can find some of these key ancient biblical details found in the tree. There's another volume that deals with biblical history here, this time on the Shem's side of the tree. Genesis 10 takes the genealogy of Shem down through Arphaxad, Salah, Eber, and Peleg. And in Genesis 11, we get Peleg down all the way to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I've got these numbers here for these genealogies because you can see this level of genealogical detail. You can count off each of these generations in the tree and identify then a line for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We do have an echo of this. We probably have an echo of one or two of the tribes of Israel. There's some ambiguity in the current genetic data. All of the tribes of Israel, I should say, we don't have that information yet. This is one of the future research projects that we are currently, or that I hope to pursue and I'm trying to do right now. This leads us to a fifth volume that's very personal. So if you're a male watching, I can tell you exactly, if you get a Y chromosome test, not just any DNA test, but specifically the inherited DNA, I can tell you exactly which son of Noah you go back to, and perhaps even a specific son of Shem or descendant of Shem or descendant of Ham, if you get one of these genealogical Y chromosome tests. Now, that's very exciting, but I also want you to understand the limitations of this. If you get a Y chromosome, I also want to speak to the ladies. So if you're a guy, you get a test, what you get is information for one small slice of your family tree. I've had my Y chromosome test. What this tells me is the unbroken line of descent. It doesn't tell me about my dad's mother's side, my dad's mother's side, my dad's mother's side, or even my maternal side. But there's a way around this. So ladies are not left out. Both males and females really have this, well, what about the ladies' side question to deal with? And one of the ways around it is to find male relatives on those branches of your family tree. So can you find relatives of your dad's mother? Did she have a brother? Is her dad still living? Or on my mother's side, we've just done this. We've had my mother's brother get his Y chromosome tested. And on my wife's side of the tree, we've been able to do about 3 of these major branches. My father-in-law got his Y chromosome tested. My mother-in-law's brother is. My father-in-law's mother's side has a whole book page dedicated to their family history. We didn't have to do a Y chromosome test. Some people already did. We just found the answer that way. So you can knock yourself out going to all sections of your tree. And I just had an interaction on Facebook. Someone was concerned, well, it looks like my line comes through Ham. What do? I said, it probably comes through multiple lines. Do you have another male relative? Yes, they did. And turned through a Semitic line. So each of our family histories is gloriously messy and complex. The more male relatives on these separate branches you can test, the bigger the picture of all the inputs into you. And this brings me again to future research. If you look at the names in Genesis 10, there's around 70. If you look at the Y chromosome tree, there are not 70 branches at the deepest parts. Now, the reason for it is dealing with global population history. I related parts of this to you earlier when we were talking about the history of the Arabian Peninsula. World history, you can see here again, around 1400, you see this uptick, and there's this huge spike in the last 200 years. To put it in blunt mathematical terms, again, the principle is that branches on the family tree reflect population size. There's nearly 8 billion branches on the family tree today. Go back 400 years, and nearly 95% of them disappear. Or what I should say is, nearly 95% of them come together. So you and I don't know who you are watching, but you and I have a 95% chance of having the same common ancestor just 600 years ago. And what that means is most of the branches on the family tree represent very recent history. The really interesting stuff that goes back to ancient times is in this 5%, the rare stuff. Now, we've only sampled the DNA from maybe 50,000, 100,000 good quality DNA sequence. And there's nearly 4 billion men alive on the globe. There's a massive amount of genetic data still to be accumulated. And that's, I think, where some of these ancient lineages lie. Now, some of those men in Genesis 10, their family lines may have gone extinct, conquered. Who knows? There's been plenty of that. Rape, pillage, slaughter for the last 4,000 years. That wouldn't surprise me. But if you're watching, you may have within you the answer to some of these ancient questions. You could call this future research project the search for the lost peoples of the world. It's sort of a genetics Indiana Jones pursuing. You can participate. You go to answersingenesis.org/go/traced. the book. It's in this website is also listed in Appendix A. Appendix A has the technical details. The initial purpose for this page was to give metal material for that, but this is also the place to go find this little button here, Hidden History of Every People Project. Click that button or simply scroll down the page. You'll find the spot where you can enter your name, email address, and message. This is the place to go if you want to participate in future research. Let's say you've taken a test or a relative has taken a Y chromosome. What do I do with it? Now, the book does have, as color plate 235, last color plate in the book, a multi-page section where if you've got a Y chromosome result that tells you here's the son of Noah you come from or your family line comes from, here's chapters that discuss the detailed history and that sort of thing. Again, sometimes these test results don't give you consistent or they give you confusing labels for the branch. Happy to help with that. I've already gotten multiple messages along these lines. It's fun to do this, and it's a great window into the past. Sixth volume of history that this Rosetta Stone research is related to deals with how we think about race and ethnicity. And I'm going to go back to an example that we just discussed with respect to Egypt's history. Notice now, I'm going to draw your attention to these small circles up here in Scandinavia. So it might be only 1%, 5% of Norwegians and Swedes belong to E1B, E1B, but there are some. And so many Scandinavians look like this pale face right here. And if you looked at your average Scandinavian, you might say, oh, of course, they've been that way in Northern Europe for long periods of time, right? Well, there are some, likely pale-faced Scandinavians, who 1,000 years ago, 1,400 years ago, had ancestors who were not pale-faced Scandinavians, but olive-skinned Arabs. And those olive-skinned Arabs, going back even further in time, had ancestors who were not olive-skinned like them, but dark-skinned Nubians. And we already mentioned some of these dark-skinned Nubians were the rulers of ancient Egypt. So take your average Northern European, whoever would have guessed that his ancestors looked like this, and were connected to these people. That's the sort of crazy narrative that emerges from this family tree for global humanity. The bottom line is, and this is just one of many examples, the so-called races have changed multiple times in human history. How could we even talk about white, Black, Asian, African when these labels have changed so many times? Imagine every school child growing up learning this sort of history completely revolutionizes how you think about race and ethnicity. How can you even talk about white supremacy? What does white even mean? How can anyone say my race is superior when your so-called race was something else a few hundred years ago? It just gets wild. I'm running short on time. I'll make this fast. 7th volume deals with Indigenous history and myths. There are multiple examples in the book where the peoples themselves say, this is who we came from or where we came from. Mainstream science would often dismiss this. Again, I gave you the quote saying, well, this is what the people say, but archaeology says something else. Genetics seems consistent with this. I've been shocked at the amount of times Indigenous history finds an almost exact match in the Y chromosome tree. It's exciting to me because it, in a sense, gives the people back their history when it's been neglected for so long. And I expect the number of these examples to increase. So if you're watching this, you belong to an Indigenous group, and you want to know your story, or you say, hey, here's who we say we came from, my guess is you will likely find the echo in this tree. And I say this is relevant to missions, because imagine you're a missionary going into an Indigenous people group. They say, this is who we came from. What they're saying may, in fact, find this echo, number one, in this tree. Number two, the tree takes you back to specific men in Genesis 10 and anchors these narratives in biblical history. And I've mentioned this before. It's worth mentioning again. I was talking to a Bible translator. He got really excited saying, the first step is always to give the people the scriptures in their own language. The next phase is to do scriptural image. How exciting would it be to be able to say, hey, we can connect your story back to a specific man in Genesis 10. This is who your people came from. So you go to, and he's a light-skinned guy like me. So he says, here I am, a light-skinned guy going to, let's say, New Guinea, dark-skinned people, and they're going to say, well, this is a white man's book. No, your story starts here. You're in this book. This is your narrative too. This is not just a white man's book. And again, if you are a missionary or Indigenous people group, go to this website, contact me this way. You can click on this button, answersandgen.org/go/traced. We'd love to speak to you about this. There's all sorts of research still left to be done. Now, last 2 volumes where the rubber really meets the road with respect to apologetics. What I've just described for you, again, all these dates where the history just jumps out based on the biblical timescale. Mainstream science thinks this is nuts. They think 6,000 years is basically equivalent to a swear word. You don't say it unless you want to be laughed at, or you avoid it if you want to be viewed as something other than a lunatic. This history and this Y chromosome tree is one of the strongest scientific arguments in print for the recent origin of humanity. You see the known history of civilization pop out from the tree when you have the biblical time frame, and this evaporates when you don't have the biblical time frame. So that there's all these very clear echoes of biblical history at the base of the tree, and there's so much more data from the Bible about the fate of these peoples that works itself out in this tree as well. Even though this book is primarily a history of people's book, it is in essence one long argument for the veracity of the young Earth timescale, one long argument for the recent origin of humanity. Now, this gets even better. This is an even bigger game changer. The last volume that this relates to deals with some of the history that led this book itself that's very significant. And I'm going to tell you some of the history that led to this book, and also the history going back a few decades that led to where we are in the creation evolution debate today. And I realize I'm running through this fast, but it's for sake of time, because there's so many things this research does, and I want you to get a flavor for some of this sizzle. If you look at the history of the creation evolution debate, I'm going to hit that point first, then the history of the book, and then hopefully all this will come together and explode. There's been a lot of back and forth between creationists and evolutionists. There's been a lot of arguments against evolution, scientific arguments against evolution from the creationist camp. I think many of them are good. There's been a lot of arguments in favor for design from the creationist camps. Even Richard Dawkins will admit, yes, the world looks designed, but, is what he'll say, and then give his explanation. There's been a lot of arguments to say in Answers in Genesis terms, hey, if you look at the evidence through the biblical glasses, it makes sense. The Genesis flood, that book from 1961, in a sense is a form of this. If you look at the fossil record and say, does it look like could it be explained by a recent flood, a global catastrophe, rapid deposition of layers? Yes, that was the point of the book. So again, I think a lot of these arguments are very good. What the evolutionary community has said is this is not enough. I'll give you one quote just for sake of time. I could give you more. This is from Niles Eldridge going back to 82. And again, I could give you some quotes to show you this has been a consistent pattern for 4 decades at least. He says, creation science isn't science at all, nor have creation scientists managed to come up with even a single intellectually compelling, scientifically testable statement about the natural world. That's the key phrase right there that shows up again and again, shows up even in federal court decisions in the United States. What the evolutionists have said is needed, not evidence against evolution, which again, I say it's good, but they say not enough. Evidence for design, not enough is what they say. Give us a testable prediction. What's a testable prediction? Well, they might say, okay, creation scientists, you all say that God created kinds of creatures 6,000 years ago, that Noah took 2 of every kind of creature on board the ark. And they might even say, okay, we recognize you don't think this is species, but maybe the family level, 2 cat-like creatures on board the ark, and then all 30 plus species of cats that exist today, they must have descended from that kind aboard the ark. Fine, that's what you believe. What predictions does this make? What statements does this make that we can scientifically investigate in the future? Predict for me, creation scientist, how many new species will form this year? That's the type of thing they've demanded. That's the type of thing I provided in October of 2017 on the broader question of the origin of species. It's also the type of thing I provided specifically with regard to human history. I won't read the quote for you for sake of time, and it's a mouthful. Basically what I said, and it's nothing unique to me. Anyone could derive this. The Bible teaches us that humanity restarted with 8 people about 4,500 years ago after the flood. Pre-flood civilization destroyed in the flood. All these fossil layers laid down. Humanity restarts. What we call the history of civilization is all post-flood, therefore only 4,500 years old, and we should be able to read off of our DNA all of these echoes of civilization. And I said specifically in the Y chromosome. This book represents the fulfillment of that type of prediction, and it makes many more predictions. And like I've been saying several times now, there's a whole new research program that emerges from this. It'll probably take me the rest of my life. In theory now, we can uncover the history of every single people group on Earth through this type of analysis. So thinking about the creation evolution debate, what other objection can the evolutionary community raise? I don't think they can. In fact, I think this now turns the tables. I fully anticipate if the evolutionists take note of this, they're going to start using arguments against my view that creationists used against evolution in times past. And if that happens, I'm going to turn around and use arguments against evolution that evolutionists have used against us. They might poke holes in what I'm saying, and I'll say, I don't care what holes you poke in my ideas, give me something better. Until evolution can make testable predictions about human history, no place at the scientific table. So there's a lot going on with this new research, very explosive, writes new volumes, creationists are making new scientific discoveries, major scientific discoveries, writing new volumes on the history of peoples, new events in prehistory, new echoes of biblical events in ancient times, echoes of the major people group of the Old Testament, Israel. We've got the ability to connect the lineage of every single male alive back to specific men in Genesis 10. This type of research rewrites how we think about, changes the discussion about so-called race and ethnicity, new applications to missions, new arguments for the age of the earth, the recent timescale, and a dramatic rewrite of the creation evolution debate. That's a big sell for this book. I invite you to investigate it for yourself. Again, I invite you to participate in the research forward. I'd love to uncover these stories. Creationists are doing science. We're doing it right now. We want to do even more. Again, this is the book that we promised in this video series that I've referred to several times, New History of the Human Race. Here's finally a slide for it. You might have seen it on YouTube. You can find it there as well on our Answers in Genesis channel. That was the first phase. And again, there's a lot more that's happened since then. Allude to some of these discoveries that are now in this book. Go to our website, answersingenesis.org/go/traced for the research. Just go to our homepage and our store to order this. If you're doing this in the UK, right now you can pre-order. Again, COVID has made all sorts of delays for shipping and such around the globe. It's selling fast. So in case you're watching this, perhaps not live, but later, and we're out of stock, and you're in the United States, we're gonna keep filling orders. You can do pre-orders for the second printing if we reach that point. And again, there's this place to participate for future research that'll be ongoing regardless of whether the book is in print or not. You can buy this book as well, Replacing Darwin. That's for sale. We don't have those shipping issues right now for that, but because this traced book is new and it's in the post-COVID era of shipping, we've got this additional headaches that deal with it. This is a book I wrote, just to clarify in terms of audience. I wrote this with a skeptic in mind. I wrote this for someone who says, I hold evolution. Why are we even talking about creation science? 10 chapters to persuade. And it gets a little bit into the weeds. I mean, I had a pastor read through it to help me make it accessible, but I do have a Replacing Darwin Made Simple version, which I wrote specifically, primarily for church people. It also says, hey, here's how species form, and now here's how to use this information when engaging an evolutionist, or you're doing street witnessing, street evangelism, teach people on the street. The 1-hour lecture version of that is something you can get a DVD of, or I think that lecture is also posted on our streaming service, answers.tv. Again, our website has thousands of articles, and a great place to keep up to speed with as new predictions are fulfilled, or there's new fulfillment of these old predictions. Bodhi Hodge has also written a book on the Tower of Babel that goes into the wider scope of this than I've had time to get into. I'm focusing rather narrowly on the genetic outcomes of this, but other things related to the Tower of Babel he goes through here. We've got a book on the racism question. Ken Ham wrote, our CEO, with Dr. Charles Ware. Charles Ware is an African-American theologian, pastor, I think. The Bible about the origin of races, about this racism debate, and the people claiming superior races, inferior races. Just to spoil the surprise for you, the Bible teaches there's one race from Adam. We're all of one blood, and we've got materials for kids as well. Really, the textbook of our ministry is this book, The Lie, the wider creation evolution issue. I've given you one narrow slice of it this evening or this afternoon, whenever you're watching. The other textbook, so to speak, of our ministry, Answers books, cover the whole gamut from astronomy, geology, paleontologics, all that's covered here. The 5th Answers book, which we're calling The Flood of Evidence, focuses on the most asked questions related to the flood and ark. We released this to coincide with the opening of the Ark Encounter here in Kentucky. We've got a bi-monthly magazine. Again, a great way to keep a finger on the pulse on. And here's finally then the image. I'm up here in the museum headquarters, the Creation Museum. So we've got offices, but this is a walk through biblical history. Visit us here, as well as 45 minutes away is the Ark Encounter, full-size, life-size replica of the Ark Encounter, decks of exhibits, and if you're able to, I highly encourage you to see how we've depicted the ethnic features of Noah's boys and their wives. If you don't get your question asked tonight afternoon, whatever time zone you're in, I've set up so you've got that web portal, answersandgenesis.org/go/traced. But I'm also on social media. Yes, I'm on Facebook. If I say enough controversial things, I don't know how much longer I'll last. So I've set up pages on MeWe and Parler and whatever else out there in terms of social media. I'm going to stop here and bring Simon back in. I run a little long. I appreciate your patience. Hopefully my enthusiasm covers some of that. But we're going to go to questions. We try to get to as many as we can. And again, if we don't get to it now, there's other ways to try to contact me. And again, I'd love to connect with you, especially if you've done DNA testing or want to in the future.
Nathaniel, are your slides off now? Have you took them off?
I think they should be, yes.
Okay, good. I think we'll have time for a couple of questions, folks. That we had a few come in while you were talking, Nathaniel. So we'll try and tackle those ones. Let me get to the first one. Philip Snow, who I believe has been watching tonight, asked this. Why did you not start post-flood civilization as the Bible did with Sumer, Shinar, and as David Roll shows, then took their ziggurat pyramids southeast into Egypt, Mitzrayim, and then worldwide?
If I understand the question, it may arise from something I didn't communicate clearly. I was focusing on Egypt and ignored Sumer simply because I had time to tell only one story. Mm-hmm. So I'm focusing on only one global civilization this afternoon, simply because one of the chapters, or basically two chapters in the book. Sumer, by the way, is one of these ancient civilizations for which we have not yet discovered the genetic echo. And I'm suspicious that it's still out there among the tens of millions of men, hundreds of millions of men who are still in the Middle East. So if you're of Middle Eastern origin, you might have within your DNA the echo of this long-lost peoples, which, again, they were there, and then there have been others who've ruled the Middle East for the thousands of years since then. And I'm quite keen to hope to be able to discover that. That may have been one of the other lineages from Babel. They may have come from one of the other men whose lineages we have yet to discover in our modern Y chromosome tree. So, great question, and a great chance for me to plug that again. I personally want to know who they came from and to be able to find that as well.
Okay, that might help answer the question that came up. Someone asked this. I'm not sure what they believe, where their ideas are coming from, but they did say, well, what about Sumerian civilization? That goes back at least farther than 6,000 years. So what do we do with that sort of data?
Yes, a great question and a great chance to clarify something here. So if I'm saying that this tree goes back only 4,500 years, well, what do you do with this? This would seem to imply either a contradiction or a major rewrite of the mainstream view. Yes, indeed. So just to clarify the logic of what's going on, meaning what is being questioned, what's being debated, and what is the evidence trying to adjudicate. The timescale itself is an inherent question mark in this whole analysis. I'm saying you can approach this tree from the perspective of the mainstream timescale, 200,000 years of human history, which would put ancient Egypt at 3100 BC and the Neolithic at 10,000 years before, 10,000 years ago, whatever it is. All that leads to one specific view of the tree. An alternative view, a testable view, scientifically testable view, is this idea that no, in fact, civilization only goes back 4,500 years. And we approach the tree that way. And my point is, when you do that, you see the known genetic echoes, or you see the genetic echoes of known civilization. You see the known, excuse me, let me phrase that again to make it clear. We know there are events of history. Roman invasions, Genghis Khan's invasion in the 1200s into Eastern Europe. You'd expect to have some sort of East Asian DNA come into Europe about that time. These are the sorts of things you should be able to see in the Y chromosome tree. And I'm arguing, yes, we can, only when you have this total time scale. Now, if what I'm saying is true, this would require some dramatic changes to what's currently accepted as mainstream dates, archaeological dates. Now, to adjudicate that question, you'd have to go into the fields of geology and archaeology and paleoanthropology and these sorts of things. And my colleagues in those fields would give their arguments for why they also think those timeframes need to be revised. But implicitly, what these genetic results imply by their success is that the mainstream timescale is wrong because it does not make accurate testable predictions. The timescale itself is the point of contention, and this research is strong positive evidence for the biblical timescale, and so you cannot invoke archaeological data within the mainstream timescale as arguments against it. This research says that's wrong because of its scientific superiority.
Great. Well, we've had a number of different people watching tonight, Nathaniel. Some people maybe are questionable about what's going on. In fact, I want to ask a question from someone who obviously thinks they've debunked what you're saying. And Lion Farmer said, where's that question gone? Hang on, let me get that back.
I'm watching it real time too. All these coming down the screen. Got to keep up with them.
Yeah. He said, I debunked Jeanson's work already as a haplogroup doesn't make CT haplogroup. So a Hamite can't make Japhethites nor Shemites.
He might have to retype this, or Lion Farm might have to retype this because it's not quite clear to me what this question is asking. I think what this is implying, and may have to maybe clarify, but I'll go with what I think the question is saying and try to address that. And if I've misinterpreted, we can revisit it. In the mainstream view, not only do you have a different time scale, you have a different orientation to the tree. Where you put the root would be the scientific term, or the beginning of the tree. I've done it differently than what the mainstream view does. Now, the mainstream view, just for those who aren't as familiar with it, says humanity evolved from primates in Africa, that humans and primates had a common ancestor millions of years ago, that anatomically modern humans evolved about 200,000, 300,000 years ago in Africa, and then about 100,000 to 50,000 years ago, these anatomically modern humans came out of Africa and then eventually populated the rest of the globe, 15,000 years ago for the entry into the Americas. That affects how you orient the tree. How they orient the Y chromosome tree, and in fact, maybe I can even pull this slide back up. I'm going to go back to, because it might be easier to see it rather than me just try to describe it verbally. You'll still have to do some mental reorientation as I show this, but I think the point can still become clear. So let me pull up that slide and minimize this here, minimize that. And if I've got to hit share screen, there we go. There we go. And if Tom can pull up that shared screen again, I think there we go. Thank you very much. So what I'm going to highlight, not only invoked a different time scale, I've invoked a different orientation. You'll notice here, these branches A and B, purple, orange, and even this section right here, that's much longer than these branches out here. The mainstream view will say that's not the beginning. They'll put the beginning right here, and you kind of have to mentally retwist and rebend these branches around that orientation point. They'll make all branches basically of the same length. They're all terminate at the same spot. And what this does is argue the origin of mankind to be among the African branches. Part of the reason they polarized the tree that way and put the beginning there is because that's where the chimpanzee lineage would come in. But where you put the beginning depends in part what you say about evolution and the human connection or lack thereof to the primates. I've argued for a different reorientation. I think we've got a massive amount of evidence. So really what I might say to someone who says, well, you can't do that, I'd say, well, why does my orientation work so well? Why does it make so much sense of human history? This is where the 100-degree change happens. The reversal of roles in the creation evolution debate. Someone's going to say, you can't do that. That's wrong. I'm going to say, well, why does it work? Give me something better. This is making great sense of the history that we know, that we all agree on. So why would I want to reorient it? Something like evolution. Now, another testable prediction of this view is that some of these branches, perhaps instead of adding 3 mistakes per generation between fathers and sons, might do 6 or 10 or something else. So if you're watching this and you've taken a Y chromosome test and you belong to one of these longer branches, I would love to speak to you about measuring the rate of mutation. No one's done this. This is a literal future testable prediction. No one in the mainstream community has measured the rate of mutation, the rate at which fathers in these long A branches pass on Y chromosome mistakes to their sons. This would be a fantastic testable prediction because the evolutionary view says that all these rates should be identical. And if in fact we find that they're fast, now there's a big problem for evolution. So if that was what the question was after, that's how I'd answer it. Again, if I've misunderstood it, then we'll have to revisit it.
Yeah, it wasn't an easy question to follow, but I hope that's answered the question. Now I'm going to ask a question, Nathaniel, that came up at the very beginning or near the beginning of the talk, and this person really wanted their question answered, and they asked, did people live longer in the Old Testament because they were genetically closer to God's creation of man?
A good question and a common one, for which there's still vigorous debate. And the basis for this comes from Genesis 5 and heavily Genesis 5, Genesis 11, where it gives us the ages of the patriarchs and key men down from Adam, his genealogy, down to Noah. And then, of course, Genesis 11, Noah's son, Shem, down through Abraham. And it tells you, in some cases, here's how old Adam was. He was 130 years old when he had his son, Seth. And then Adam lived this many years, had other sons and daughters, and then he died. And then Seth lived this long, and so the genealogy goes. And of course, the ages of these men, especially pre-flood, they all hover around 900 years long, much longer than anything seen today. If you then look at the ages post-flood, and people have done this, they've actually graphed it out, it follows almost a mathematically precise exponential decay curve. Yes, Noah lives 950, but none of his offspring do. Shem, I think, is about 600, if I remember right, and then it drops off, and Abraham is 175, I think, drops off, and then, of course, comes down closer to this day. Mm-hmm. The question, of course, is why? Why did these guys live so long, and why did these ages drop off so fast? And there's been two major explanations given in the creationist literature and in creationist discussions. Number one, you look at the fossil record. So this is now applying the creationist scientific model in whole, not just biology. Also creationist paleontology, geology, and so forth, which would say the fossil record is primarily the record of the flood. There are lots of creatures, plants that are now extinct. And long story short, what this implies is that the pre-flood world is very different from the post-flood world. Some would say, during the flood is when these plates moved. Obviously, it looks like South America fits into Africa. Once one landmass separated perhaps during the flood. Again, this is a lot of geology I'm summarizing over very quickly. Different environment, different landmass. Could it have been more optimal, more conducive to longevity? And then, of course, post-flood, we have an ice age within the creationist scheme. Massive environmental change, climate change, unlike anything we see today. And so could all of this have played a role? Was it environment, basically? If you summarize that in one word, was it the environment that has dramatically changed human lifespans? The second explanation is more in line with the question, was it genetics? We've had 4,500 years of mutations, mistakes added to our DNA since then. And I would say I have a very strong, I don't know answer to those. It may take some time to work this out. I will say that my own personal thinking has changed on the relationship between genetics and human disease. So my PhD work was in human health, working on adult blood stem cells, the cells that sustain our body. Red blood cells in our bodies live about 3 months. Something has to keep replenishing them so you don't asphyxiate because you can't get oxygen to your cells. Stem cells sustain this. They're, of course, a hot topic for therapy and such. Not the embryonic stuff, but the adult stuff. And at the time, or early on in my career, I would often dismiss genetic explanations for disease as hand-waving. Now, there's some very clear examples. Sickle cell anemia, you can trace to specific DNA changes. Cystic fibrosis to specific DNA changes. But to invoke it everywhere, I poo-pooed just because I thought that you just don't have anything better to say. So you invoke genetics because it's the hot term. Hocus pocus, who cares? Now that I've done more work on human genetic history, I've warmed back up to the idea. Could we be reaching a stage in human history where there's a tipping point and all those good variants we inherited from Adam and Eve are getting mutated? And so are we coming to a crisis point at which we're going to see more and more diseases emerge? I'm not ready to say, yes, we are, but I've warmed up to this concept. And am willing to consider things like lifespan decreasing because of increase in genetic mutations or lack of the good variants back to Adam and Eve. So it's an I don't know, but it's an I don't know with a big but. Here's some things to consider thereafter.
Yeah, well, that was helpful, and hopefully the person who asked the question is still listening, and that's been a great benefit to you. Well, we'll end with that question because we could go on and on and on forever and ever, but we have to stop sometime, Nathaniel. But it's been a great talk. I know well over 300 people were watching on multiple different media services, so we're very thankful for everyone who's watched tonight. Nathaniel, do you want to end by saying anything?
Just point people again, if you want to purchase the book, you can go to answersandgenesis.org. We've got international. Yeah, and I forgot to mention I was going to show the middle section. I don't know if you can see it on camera, but there we go. You've got the cream colored pages and the white here in the middle. That's all the color plates. There's 175 pages of this. There we go. I'm going to view myself in the mirror. All the maps, charts, you'll probably see as I'm flipping through here something that may have looked familiar from our discussion of Egypt. The text itself is only about 200 pages long. And again, I'd like to think this book is more accessible than Replacing Darwin. We do get into weeds with Replacing Darwin because we're trying to overturn 150 years of claims. This builds on that. You don't have to have read Replacing Darwin to understand Traced. It's a standalone, but the research does organically connect to it. It's fulfilling predictions. So Traced, though, mainly focuses on family trees, dates, maps. I think that's a lot easier to follow. There's not 3 chapters of genetics education that Replacing Darwin has to read this. So I think it's going to be a lot easier read, an explosive read. Again, you can find it. We still have it in stock here in the United States right now as of March 25. But if we do run out, we're going to be taking pre-orders or preemptive orders, whatever you want to call it, as we wait for the second shipment to come in. Again, because of COVID and all this, these logistical delays make this take time. I think the current estimate for the second printing is about June, but it's been selling well. And I think Simon mentioned as well, if you're in the UK, or I've had people email me this book in Australia, I think the Canada store will carry this as well. But answersandgenesis.org, find your country in the upper right for country-specific orders. And then if you want to participate in future research, you want help with your genetic results, you go to answersandgenesis.org/go/traced. And of course, Traced is the name of the book. There'll be that place you can enter your information. I've already received all sorts of people emailing in. It's been a great start. I really look forward to where this is going. So thanks to all of you who have been watching, and especially thanks to you who are going to help us going forward.
Yeah, thank you everyone for watching. Thank you, Nathaniel, for being with us. And if you want to get the book, you can get it at Answers in Genesis store at answersandgenesis.org. And if you're in the UK, you'll have to wait a few months because we're still having to wait for the shipment to come in. That won't be in till around July, but you can pre-order the book there. Just so you know, guys, we will not be back next week because of our speaking schedule, but we will be back on April the 8th, where I'll be sitting down and we'll be speaking with Henry Smith from the Associates of Biblical Research. And they have just found an amazing inscription in Israel on a stone, which is some really great evidence. But I'm not going to actually tell you what it is about. So I'm going to tell you to tune in on April the 8th, where I'll be speaking with Henry Smith, and they'll be just talking about this amazing archaeological discovery. And we'll also get into why archaeology actually supports what the Bible tells us. It backs up the history in the Bible. So hopefully you'll be able to join us in 2 weeks' time. But thank you for being with us this evening. And please do make sure you get a copy of Dr. Jeanson's brand new book, Traced, available at answersandgenesis.org. Good night and God bless.